topic today is called the absolute value of a number. Have we ever seen such a thing before that has these brackets on it? Has anybody seen those? Physics maybe? I'm not sure. No? Okay. So these brackets around a number, it's like a bracket but they're just straight, is called an absolute value of a number. So absolute value, here's the definition. It's the magnitude of a number without the regard to its sign. So this is kind of how I think about it. Let's pretend if you went a distance. So if you went 5 kilometers north, that would be thinking like a +5. And 5 kilometers south with direction would be like a -5 from here. So it's got direction on it, right? But when I take the absolute value, I just say, well, what distance did I go? Without caring about the direction, the absolute value of 5, the absolute value of -5, both people traveled north, south, both people traveled a distance of 5. So this is what I'm thinking. It's the number without regard to the direction. It's the magnitude of the number, so like the distance of the number, without the north or south on it. Okay, so the absolute value of 3 is 3. The absolute value of -3 is 3. Okay, next, I have to treat this like brackets, so I have to do inside the brackets first. So what is 2 subtract 7? -5. What's the absolute value of -5? 5. Okay, so inside first. So what's 10 subtract 2? 8. What's the absolute value of 8? 8. Okay. What's this value? What's the absolute value of -15? What's that? The absolute value of -15 is 15. But then what does this mean to do? Times it by -1. Because it's on the outside. That's why that's a negative, because it's on the outside of the bracket. Okay? Okay. Now we're going to start to solve equations. So I want you to think about, what could I absolute that would be a 4 result? The absolute value of 4 would give me 4, right? So x equals 4. What else could I absolute value that would turn into a 4? What about a -4? Does that work? The absolute value of -4 turns into a 4. Okay. Next. So 2x is inside the brackets. So I'm just deciding right now, what could I have inside the brackets? So what absolute would give me 10? If it was inside the brackets was a 10, or if the inside of the bracket was a -10. The absolute value of 10 is 10, the absolute value of -10 is 10. So I'm taking turns making the inside bracket be the positive version and the negative version. That's what I'm doing. Okay, so now I'm going to solve. So in one situation, x could be 5. And in this situation, x could be negative 5. Okay, number 3. The inside of the bracket could equal one thing, or the inside could equal another thing. So the inside of the bracket is equal to, that's what I'm doing there, the inside of the bracket. What number could we have inside the bracket? The inside of the bracket could equal, if this was 5, or what else could we have right in this position? We could have had a negative 5. So the inside of the bracket in there could have been a 5, or it could have been a negative 5. Okay, number 1 here, I'm going to add 2. So x could have been a 7. I'm going to add 2. Be careful there. What could x be on that one? Negative 3. So those are my 2 options. If x was negative 3 subtract 2 is negative 5. The absolute value of negative 5 is 5. See how that works out? Okay. Can you try this one on your own? So split it. So inside the bracket, you could have had this option or this option. Can you split the situation, saying the inside piece could be 11, or the inside piece could be negative 11. Okay, so that's the split. So I'm going to subtract 5, so x could have been 6. Or negative 16. Okay, now we're going to up it a notch here. I'm going to do something additional in this equation. What's the thing I'm going to do first, do you think? I'm going to actually get that negative 5 out of there. Okay, so it's very important that I have the absolute value alone. I can't do my splitting up thing until I have it alone. Okay, now, what is this inside piece allowed to be? The inside could have been an 8. The inside could have also been a negative 8. Okay, I get a lot of errors on this one because I get people who split up this situation with a 3 and a negative 3. You can't do that. You have to do your splitting up once you have this absolute value alone. Okay, so now it's just some algebra stuff. So subtract 2, divide by 3, subtract 2, divide by 3, Okay, next. So we now know that we're going to have to isolate the absolute value first. So I'm going to have to take away 5. Okay, and now I'm going to stop. I'm not going to split. Because what's happening in this situation, this is something different now. When I absolute value something, will its result ever be negative? Nope. You cannot absolute value something and it be negative. Okay? The absolute value of negative 5 is positive 5. Okay, so here, if I absoluted 2, it would turn into 2. If I absoluted negative 2, it would turn into 2. Nothing you can absolute will turn into negative. Okay, next. So I'm going to have to add 20. Okay, so that's the first step, is get that absolute alone. Now I can state. Inside those brackets, I would have either had an 18 or a negative 18. So inside those brackets would have either been an 18 or a negative 18. There was 2 options. Okay, so isolate absolute, make your splits, and then algebra. So add 7, divide by 8. Okay, and fractions, just leave as fractions. Is all good. Okay, I'm going to, I think I have to flip a couple pages here in your notes. Okay, it's like almost near the end of your notes, actually. Okay. Let's figure out some rules. What happens if I absolute value a positive number? So for instance, what's the absolute value of 5? 5. So what happened to it? It stays the same. Right? So the absolute value of 5 was 5. It didn't change. What do you think would happen if I absolute value 0? We haven't really talked about this one. Any predictions? What would happen with the absolute value of 0? What's the magnitude of that? Still 0. It's like second from the end, or third from the end. You see it? It says graphing absolute values. Okay, what do you think about absoluting a negative number? So what's the absolute value of negative 5? What happened to it? It changes, right? So those are the 3 rules. The absolute value of a positive just stayed. The absolute of 0 will stay. The absolute value of a negative, that's going to change. Okay, so we're going to graph the absolute value of this graph. Okay, so we're going to use the rules. If you see the graph be 0 or positive, it stays. So do you see this portion right here? It's positive and 0, right? So it's going to stay. So I'm going to overlap. I'm going to overlap it. If it's going to stay, I'm going to overlap it. Okay, now I'm looking at this chunk of the graph. This chunk of the graph is positive, or there's a dot that's 0, right? So this is also going to stay. It's not going to move. And when I'm talking about positive, are you understanding that I'm looking at the y heights? The heights are positive? Okay, this portion of the graph is negative for y, right? Y. So where can, for instance, this coordinate 1, -3, it's going to move? It's going to move to the coordinate 1, +3. So there's my final graph. So do you see this negative portion? Do you actually see that it's a reflection? I just changed all that negative and I flipped it over to its positive. Okay, so if I put my pen here, this coordinate was 3, -1. Now it's 3, +1 instead of -1 height. So I flipped all the heights over to its positive side. Okay, so let's try number 3 and then we'll go back to 2. So where on this graph will I overlap because it's not going to move? So anything positive or 0 so that's all going to stay. There's 1, 2, 3 sections that don't move. Okay, so there's 2 sections that were negative height, so we're going to have to flip them all the way across. So let's just check out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That was at a -7, so it's going to have to move to a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's going to have to move to a +7. There's the visual of it changing from a negative to a positive. Okay, so this was also at a -7. Okay, so I left all the pieces that were positive or 0, and then the negative sections I flipped. So if I cover this up because it's not there anymore, do you notice how every single part of my graph now is 0 or above, right? Okay, and the last one. So graph the absolute value, y equals the absolute value of x minus 5. So first of all, without the absolute values, it would look like that. Do you know how to graph this? Do you know how to graph that? It's grade 10. What is it? What shape? It's going to make a line, a straight line. What's the info you know about that line? Y equals mx plus b. What's the info you know? Do you know a y-intercept on that line? -5. Do you know a slope on that line? The slope is 1x, so then 1 and 1 over 1 as a fraction, right? Okay, so I'm going to draw that, and I'm going to draw it, should we just like dash it lightly? Because it's not our graph, but we're just going to dash it lightly. So -5, up 1, right 1. Okay, that's not my graph, but it's going to start me thinking about what I want to do. So there's what that line would look like. Okay, how do I absolute value that graph? So what are you going to do? Where do you see this line above? So wherever you see it above will stay above the x-axis and equal to the x-axis. So this part of the line will stay. Okay, what about the part of the line that had been below the x-axis? So for instance, this coordinate 0, -5, where will it be moved to? Should go 0, +5. So then that would be my final graph. Okay, do you notice how this graph had arrows? This had arrows. This one didn't. So be careful. If my graph has arrows, yours has arrows. If my graph doesn't have arrows, your graph doesn't have arrows, right? Don't forget arrows or don't add arrows when they aren't there.